Having discussed in the previous lecture the concepts generally of application architecture, in this video we'll turn our attention to application architecture in Spring Boot. We have to remember that Spring Boot is opinionated, which means that many decisions about the very many possibilities have already been made and imposed by the framework. And so when we're writing an application in Spring Boot, we work within the decisions already made by the opinionated framework. And we'll talk in a later video about some of the architectural options that are available to us. When we're writing a RESTful application, we will be using MVC, but primarily the model and the controller, because the view typically will be in a web application. So the controller will receive the HTTP requests, and we'll have, as we have already seen, REST controller classes that will receive those requests and process them. But up until now, we've done all the processing in the controller, and that's not really very good for an application architecture, especially as the application gets bigger. We've got away with it to a certain extent because our application has been very small. But now it's time to consider the architectural decisions that are needed. Now, Spring Boot provides other architectural components that we can use. So the controller will receive the requests and pass those requests on to one or more services. Each service provides business logic, and they are annotated as service classes. We've also got available a repository class, and we can annotate our own classes with the repository annotation, and it's these classes that interact with the database. For the rest of this video, what we're going to do is to look at how we can start with something that we've written thus far and refactor it into a much better architecture. We can see in this application that we have got just the REST controller. Let's take a look at this. In the REST controller, we've got our various endpoints. For example, we're going to count the vowels in a sentence. And to do that, we're going to call other methods. And as we look down through these methods, we can see that update vowels method is going to connect to the database, execute a prepared statement once for each vowel, and then close the connection. So the interaction with the database is built into the controller, as is the vowel counting. Here's another method that interacts with the database, and here are the methods for getting a connection and closing a connection. Now these methods are doing far too much work for a controller, and so what we want to do is to refactor this code, take all this database interaction and put it into a repository, and all the other methods that manipulate data, they need to go into a service class. Not only that, but because we're interacting with the database, it would be a much better idea to have some migration scripts. And that's what we're going to do with the first part of the refactoring. We're going to set up a repeatable migration that will create and recreate the vowel count table in the database. We'll keep the REST controller, but we will rename it, and we'll introduce service and repository class that will count vowels in the service and that will interact with the database in the repository. Let's see how that's done. So here's our example. Just by looking at the project structure, you can see that there is quite a bit more going on. For example, in the MVC version, we've got our migration, which wasn't here previously. We've also got a renamed controller. The name explicitly says what the class is doing. And we've got the service and repository classes as well. So with the addition of just 3 more files, we can considerably improve the architecture of our application. Let's take a look at the individual classes. On the left, we have the original controller. See how much code there is in there? 123 lines in total. after the refactoring, where we remove all the model code and all the database interaction code, what we're left with is this, just 23 lines of code. That's a huge improvement and makes the class much more readable. We can see that count vowels, which is this one here, it's the same endpoint, but instead of doing all of this, all it's going to do now is to delegate the work that it was originally doing to the vowel count service and call count vowels in there. And whatever this method returns, this endpoint will return to the client. Let's go and have a look in here. We can see that count vowels in our service looks very similar to what we had before. And that's no surprise because we've just literally moved it from one place to another and then called it from the simplified controller. But instead of calling methods within itself that interact with the database, what it's now doing is delegating that work to the repository. So let's go and have a look at the repository. And we can see that what we had previously in update vowels is there in the repository class. So we haven't made any huge changes. We've just relocated code from this monolithic class into a set of smaller classes, albeit that gives us more classes. This mini class explosion is nothing to be worried about because it gives us such a better architecture, and it allows us now to see much more readily where the different bits of code reside. We know that the controller is going to have interaction from a client. We know that the service is going to do the business logic and that the repository is going to interact with the database. Those responsibilities are clearly indicated, not just by the name, but also by the knowledge that we have about the architecture. And so if we had a problem with the database, we would know immediately that we just go and look in this class here, because we know that a repository in our architecture interacts with a database. Although we have greatly improved the architecture of our application, there are still some problems. We are not really using dependency injection to its maximum benefit. There is some in there, even though we haven't talked about that yet. So in a later video, we'll talk about dependency injection and how Spring Boot uses dependency injection to make the life of the developer even easier. And the repository still has got some limitations, and we'll talk about how to improve that in another video. If you want to do some background reading about some of the terms we've talked about in this video, then do a search for controller service repository and find out as much as you can.